In the year 1881, a man who had lost everything made the one choice that could kill him. He saved his enemy. The Arizona Territory stretched vast and merciless under an April sun that showed no mercy. This was land that punished the weak and broke the strong. The desert near Copper Creek Basin was a place of sharp rocks and scattered brush, where the heat rose in shimmering waves and the silence pressed down like a weight on the chest. This was country that asked questions of every man who crossed it, and most men failed the test. Elijah Stone knew this land. He had known it for 3 years now, ever since the fire. He was 37 years old, though his face carried the lines of a much older man. Born in Missouri, raised hard, and aged even harder by a war he never believed in, he had come west not seeking fortune, but forgetfulness. The small ranch he had built with his own 2 hands sat alone in a valley where nothing grew easy, and survival was the only victory that mattered. The people in Copper Creek, the nearest settlement 5 miles to the south, called him the Ghost. They said he had died the night his family burned, and what rode into town once a month for supplies was just a shadow wearing the shape of a man. They were not entirely wrong. On this particular morning, Elijah sat his horse at the edge of a ravine, tracking 3 stray cattle that had wandered north toward Apache territory. His gelding, a dusty brown animal with more scars than spirit, had stopped. Suddenly ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to the rifle on his saddle, his pale blue eyes scanning the broken landscape ahead. The ground told a story written in blood and violence. Dark stains had soaked into the red earth and dried to black. A broken cavalry saber lay half buried in the sand. Strips of blue uniform fabric clung to the thorns of a mesquite bush. There had been a fight here recent enough that the buzzards had not yet finished their work. Elijah dismounted slowly, his right leg dragging slightly as his boot hit the ground. An old wound from Shiloh that never healed right. He moved forward with the careful steps of a man who had survived one war and did not intend to die in another. His hand stayed near his revolver thumb, resting on the hammer. Then he saw her. At first his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. A body lay twisted in the shadow of a rock outcropping, half covered in dust and blood. The clothing was Apache, the traditional dress of a warrior, torn and stained beyond recognition. But it was what lay below the waist that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. Both legs ended in crude stumps just above where the knees should have been. Thick bindings, once white, but now soaked through with dried blood, wrapped the wounds. The flesh around them was swollen and angry, but not yet rotting. This had happened days ago, maybe a week, and somehow impossibly the chest was still moving. Elijah stood frozen, his shadow falling across the woman's face. Her eyes opened just a fraction. Dark eyes the color of creek water in shadow, fixed on him with an expression he had seen before. Not fear, not pleading. Just a quiet acceptance of death, the look of a warrior who had fought the last fight and lost. Every instinct Elijah possessed screamed at him to walk away, to take his horse, find his cattle, and ride back to his ranch as if he had seen nothing. This was trouble of the worst kind. An Apache woman on his land meant death if the wrong people found out. The soldiers would call it treason. The vigilantes would call it race mixing. The bounty hunters would not bother with names at all. He could leave her. The sun would finish what the cavalry had started. She might last another hour, perhaps 2, if she was as strong as she looked. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. The only logical choice for a man who had already lost everything that mattered. But she was breathing. That simple fact, that shallow rise and fall of her chest, that stubborn refusal to surrender to death, held Elijah Stone in place as surely as chains. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The desert wind pulling at his coat, the sun burning the back of his neck, and, somewhere deep in the hollow place where his heart used to be, something stirred. He had not saved anyone in 3 years. Not since the night he rode home to find his cabin burning the flames, reaching for the stars, and his wife Catherine's screams cutting through the roar of the fire. Not since he had torn through the burning doorway to find his 2-year-old daughter Lily's body in the corner, her favorite doll clutched in her small hands. Not since he had carried them both out into the yard and knelt there in the ashes until morning came and found him still holding what remained of his family. Since that night, Elijah Stone had been a dead man walking. He worked his land because work kept the memories at bay. He ate because his body demanded it. He slept when exhaustion claimed him, though sleep never brought rest, only dreams of fire and screaming. He existed in the narrow space between life and death, neither fully one nor the other, asking nothing of the world and offering nothing in return. But this woman was breathing. Elijah removed his wide-brimmed hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at the sky as if searching for an answer written in the clouds. The sky offered only silence. He looked at the woman again, at the terrible wounds, at the quiet dignity in her half-open eyes, at the way her fingers had dug into the sand, as if trying to hold on to life with nothing but will. "God damn it," he whispered, and the words were both prayer and curse. He stepped forward, knelt beside her in the dirt, and slipped his arms beneath her back and under where her knees should have been. Her body was terrifyingly light, as if the loss of her legs had somehow stolen half her substance. But she was not dead weight. When his hands touched her, she flinched, a small involuntary tremor that ran through her entire frame. Her eyes opened wider, focusing on his face with sudden sharp awareness. For a moment they simply looked at each other. A white man and an Apache woman, a Confederate veteran and a warrior of the Chiricahua. Two people who should have been enemies meeting in the middle of nowhere with death hanging in the air between them like smoke. Elijah did not speak. Words seemed inadequate, even insulting in the face of what she had endured. Instead, he simply stood, adjusting her weight against his chest, and turned back toward his horse. She made a sound, then a low groan that came from somewhere deep in her chest, the sound of pain that had been held back too long, finally breaking free. But Elijah did not pause. He had made his choice. Now he would see it through wherever it led. The ride back to the ranch took 90 minutes that felt like days. Elijah held the woman in one arm, her head lolling against his chest, her breath a faint whisper against his skin. His horse moved carefully, sensing the precious cargo, picking its way through the rocky terrain with unusual care. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into an oven, and Elijah could feel the heat radiating from the woman's body, the fever already building in her blood. His ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage. The small cabin, patched with whatever materials he could salvage, leaned slightly to the left. The barn beside it listed in the opposite direction, as if the two buildings were holding each other up through sheer stubbornness. A windmill creaked in the breeze, pulling water from deep underground. 15 head of cattle grazed in a fenced pasture that looked too small for the vast emptiness surrounding it. It was not much, but it was what Elijah had built with his own hands, and it was all he had left in the world. He carried the woman straight through the cabin door and laid her gently on his own cot, a narrow frame with a thin wool blanket and a single flat pillow. The cabin was a single room 12 feet by 14, with rough wooden walls and a dirt floor covered by planks he had hewn himself. A fireplace dominated one wall. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A rifle rack held 3 weapons. A trunk in the corner contained everything Catherine had owned still unopened after 3 years. The woman's eyes moved, tracking the room, taking in every detail, even through her pain. She was assessing, Elijah realized. Even now broken and bleeding, she was a warrior evaluating her surroundings, searching for threats, planning escape routes. It was the trained response of someone who had fought to survive and refused to stop fighting even when survival seemed impossible. Elijah went to work with the efficiency of a man who had done battlefield medicine during the war. He fetched clean water from the barrel by the door, set a pot to boil on the stove, and gathered the supplies he would need. Clean cloth torn from an old bedsheet. A bottle of whiskey more than half full because he never touched the stuff anymore. Pine sap mixed with tobacco, an old army remedy for preventing infection. A needle and thread he used for repairing saddles. He returned to the cot and carefully lifted the edge of her dress. The woman tensed, her dark eyes fixing on his face with sudden sharp awareness, her hand moving instinctively toward where a weapon should be. Elijah met her gaze steadily, then deliberately averted his eyes, focusing only on the wounds, his touches as respectful as the circumstances allowed. The stumps were worse up close. The flesh was swollen and red, the edges of the wounds ragged, where whoever had done this had not bothered with clean cuts. But there was no smell of rot yet, no telltale black threading of blood poisoning spreading up what remained of her thighs. The wounds were days old, not weeks. If he worked fast and the fever did not take her, she might live. Elijah cleaned the wounds with the boiled water, his hands moving with practiced care. The woman did not cry out, though he felt her entire body go rigid with pain. She simply watched him, her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin, her breathing harsh and shallow through her nose. When he unwrapped the old bindings, dried blood and sand fell away in clumps. The wounds beneath were raw and weeping. Elijah washed them again with the whiskey, and this time the woman did make a sound, a sharp intake of breath that might have been the beginning of a scream, swallowed before it could escape. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his skin hard enough to leave marks. Their eyes met again. Hers were filled with pain and fury and something else, something harder to name. A kind of bitter respect, perhaps, or merely acknowledgement that this white man was at least trying not to cause more damage than necessary. Elijah applied the pine sap mixture to the wounds, then wrapped them in clean strips of cloth, binding them firmly, but not too tight. His hands, though calloused and rough from years of hard work, moved with surprising gentleness. These were the hands that had held his dying daughter, that had closed his wife's eyes one final time. They remembered how to be tender even when the heart had forgotten. When he finished, the sun was setting beyond the single small window. Orange light slanted across the cabin floor, turning the dust motes in the air to gold. The woman had fallen into an uneasy sleep, her breath coming fast and shallow, the fever already claiming her. Elijah covered her with his blanket, then stood and moved to the far side of the room. He sat at the table, his arms folded on the scarred wood, and watched her chest rise and fall in the failing light. Outside, a coyote called to the rising moon. The windmill creaked. The desert settled into its evening silence. And Elijah Stone, the man they called the Ghost, felt something he had not felt in 3 long years. Not hope exactly, not purpose, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of something that might in time become one or the other. He had brought a dying woman into his home, an Apache warrior, an enemy of his people, someone whose very presence could destroy what little remained of his life. He had invited danger through his door, danger that could end with a noose around his neck or a bullet in his back. Every rational thought in his head told him he had made a mistake, that he should have left her in the desert, that mercy was a luxury a man in his position could not afford. But as darkness filled the cabin and the woman's quiet breathing became the only sound in the world, Elijah found he could not regret his choice. For the first time since the fire, he had chosen something other than death. He had chosen life, even if that life belonged to someone else. The woman woke before dawn in that gray hour when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on the rough wooden ceiling above her. For a moment she simply lay still, taking inventory of her body, assessing the damage. The pain in her legs was different now, sharper but cleaner, the dulling ache of infection replaced by the bright bite of fresh wounds properly tended. She reached down with one hand, her fingers finding the edge of the blanket, then moving lower to touch the bindings. Still there. Still gone. the stumps that ended where her legs should continue the permanent proof of what the cavalry had taken from her. Her throat tightened, but no sound came out. She had already screamed herself raw in the days after the explosion. There were no screams left, only this hollow ache where rage and grief had burned themselves out. A sound outside made her turn her head, bootsteps steady and unhurried, crunching across the hard-packed dirt. She tensed her hand, moving automatically to her side, searching for the knife that was no longer there. The door opened, and morning light spilled into the cabin. The white man entered, carrying a tin bowl. He moved with that slight limp she had noticed yesterday favoring his right leg. His face was weathered and lined. His brown hair shot through with gray at the temples, though he could not be more than 40. His eyes, pale blue like winter sky, barely glanced at her as he set the bowl on a wooden crate beside the cot. Barely glanced at her as he set the bowl on a wooden crate beside the cot. Bread soaked in broth. The smell made her stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. She had not eaten in 4 days, maybe 5. Time had blurred together in the desert, measured only by the arc of the sun and the slow approach of death. But she did not reach for the food. She just looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable, waiting to see what he would do, waiting to understand what price this mercy would carry. Elijah met her gaze without flinching. He did not smile. He did not offer explanations or ask questions. He simply nodded once, a slight dip of his head that might have been acknowledgement or greeting, or simply the recognition that she was awake and aware. Then he turned and walked back toward the door. The woman spoke, her voice a dry, cracking rasp that barely qualified as sound. Silent man. Elijah paused at the threshold, his back to her, his hand on the door frame. He stood there for a long moment, silhouette against the brightening sky. Then he stepped through and pulled the door closed behind him, leaving her alone with the food and the silence and the strange, unsettling realization that for the first time in days she did not feel like she was dying. Outside, Elijah stood on the porch and looked at the horizon. The sun was breaking over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He pulled out his pipe, filled it with tobacco, and lit it with practiced motions. The smoke curled up into the morning air, and for just a moment he allowed himself to remember Catherine's voice. "You did the right thing, Eli," she would have said. Catherine had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost them, even when it hurt. "I hope so," Elijah whispered to the empty desert. "God help me, I hope so." Inside the cabin, the woman they would come to know as Naichi sat propped against the wall, the bowl of bread and broth in her lap. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling strength return to her body, one spoonful at a time. And as she ate, she studied the cabin around her, noting the rifles on the wall, the lack of any woman's belongings, the single chair at the table, the way dust gathered in the corners because no one cared enough to sweep. This man lived alone. This man was broken in ways that went deeper than the scar on his face or the limp in his walk. This man had saved her not because he wanted something, but because he no longer had anything left to lose. Silent man, she repeated, testing the name. It fit him. And in this small, crude cabin in the middle of nowhere, 2 broken souls had found each other. They did not know it yet, but this was the beginning of something neither law, nor hatred, nor death itself could easily destroy. The wind rose strong that morning, rattling the shutters and sending dust devils spinning across the yard. Inside the cabin, morning light crept across the floor in slow increments. Naichi had not touched the second bowl of food Elijah left. It sat cold on the crate when he returned near mid-morning, his arms full of kindling for the stove. His boots made hollow sounds on the floorboards. She did not flinch this time. She had pulled herself into a sitting position against the wall, using her arms to prop herself up the blanket covering what remained of her legs. Her eyes tracked him across the room, sharp and clear, the fever temporarily driven back by rest and whatever medicine he had used. Elijah set the kindling beside the stove without a word. He moved to the water barrel, filled a cup, drank it in 3 long swallows. As he passed near the cot, He noticed her fingers twitching, saw her trying to adjust her position to sit straighter. Her face tightened with effort, and a small sound escaped her lips before she could stop it. Her hand flew to her side, pressing against ribs that were probably bruised or cracked. Elijah paused, then crouched beside her. "You will tear the stitches," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. The first full sentence he had spoken to her. Nietzsche's eyes widened slightly. He spoke. The silent man had a voice after all, and it was deeper than she expected, colored with an accent she recognized from prisoners she had heard at Fort Bowie. Missouri, maybe, or Kansas. Somewhere east where they grew their vowels long and flat. Before she could respond, he slipped one arm behind her back and helped her sit up straighter. She could feel the heat radiating through his shirt, the solid strength in his arm, the careful way he moved to avoid jarring her wounds. When she was properly positioned, he let go and stepped back. He pulled over an old three-legged stool, the wood worn smooth with age and use. "Try this," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a request or an offer of charity, just a practical solution to a problem. Nietzsche did not move immediately. She studied the stool, then looked back at him. Pride warred with practicality in her eyes. She was Apache. She was Chiricahua. She did not accept help easily, especially from white men, but she was also intelligent enough to recognize that refusing aid out of pride was just another form of surrender. She nodded once, a sharp dip of her chin. Elijah pointed to the stool, demonstrating how she should slide forward from the cot, how to brace her arms, how to transfer her weight. Then he stepped back and let her do it herself. The process was agonizing. Nietzsche gritted her teeth so hard Elijah could hear them grinding. Sweat broke out on her forehead and ran down her temples. Her arms shook with the effort of supporting her body's weight. But inch by inch, she moved from the cot to the stool, her breathing harsh and ragged, her entire focus narrowed to this single task. When she finally settled onto the stool, balanced precariously but upright, she sat for a full minute, just breathing. Her palms rested on what remained of her thighs, her fingers pressing into the flesh as if trying to feel something that was no longer there. Her eyes swept the cabin again, taking in new details from this different angle. The rifle by the door, the pair of worn boots near the fireplace, the long crack that ran through the wall above the stove. The place was worn lived in, but also somehow hollow, as if the man who dwelt here was merely occupying space rather than inhabiting it. "You live here alone." The question came out stronger than her first words, though still rough around the edges. Elijah nodded as he moved to the stove, adding wood to coals that still glowed from breakfast. Nietzsche watched him work. His movements were efficient, economical, the habits of a man who had spent years taking care of himself. No wasted motion, no hesitation. When he set a pot of stew to warm on the stove, she noticed the way his hands shook slightly just for a moment before he steadied them. "You could have left me," she said, and it was not quite a question, not quite an accusation, just a statement of fact that hung in the air between them. Elijah turned to face her, his pale blue eyes meeting her dark ones directly. "I did not," he replied simply. The silence that followed was not hostile, but it was heavy, weighted with all the things neither of them was ready to say, the questions that had no easy answers, the choices that could not be unmade, the danger that grew with every hour she remained under his roof. Elijah scooped stew into a fresh tin bowl and brought it to her. This time, she took it immediately, her fingers wrapping around the warm metal. She ate slowly, methodically, her eyes never leaving his face. He did not stare back. He simply stayed nearby, close enough to help if she needed it, far enough away to give her space and dignity. Later that afternoon, while Elijah was in the shed fetching nails to repair a loose board on the barn, Nietzsche tried to move on her own. She had been studying the layout of the cabin for hours, measuring distances with her eyes, planning routes. The water barrel stood maybe 10 feet from the cot, 10 feet that might as well have been 10 miles. When Elijah returned, he found her halfway across the floor, dragging herself forward with both arms, her face soaked with sweat, the blanket trailing behind her like a broken wing. She had made it perhaps 5 feet before exhaustion, or pain, or both, had forced her to stop. But she had not given up. She was still moving inch by agonizing inch, her jaw set, her breathing harsh. Elijah stood in the doorway watching her. His own scars ached in sympathy. The bullet wound in his hip that never quite healed. The shrapnel embedded in his shoulder that doctors said would kill him if they tried to remove it. The internal damage that sometimes made breathing feel like drowning. He knew what it meant to force a broken body to keep moving when every nerve screamed to stop. Nietzsche looked up, sensing his presence. Her eyes blazed with a fierce light that was part fury, part determination, and part shame at being caught in such a vulnerable position. "I am not going to rot in that bed," she said through clenched teeth, her voice low and dangerous. Elijah did not argue. He crossed the room, knelt beside her, and lifted her carefully by the arms. She tensed when his hands touched her ribs, but she did not pull away or protest. He carried her back to the cot and set her down gently, then straightened and walked out of the cabin without a word. Inside, Nietzsche pounded her fist against the cot frame, once a single blow that expressed all the frustration and rage she could not put into words. Outside, Elijah stood in the harsh afternoon sunlight, his hands on his hips, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. Then he walked to the barn and disappeared inside. That night, under the flickering light of a hanging oil lamp, Elijah worked. The sound of sawing and hammering drifted across the yard and through the cabin walls. Nietzsche lay on the cot listening to the rhythmic sounds of construction, wondering what the silent man was building, wondering if it was a coffin or something else entirely. By morning, it was finished. Elijah carried it into the cabin, a contraption made from the frame of an old broken chair with small wheels salvaged from a cart and cloth padding on the base. He set it beside her cot without ceremony or explanation. Nietzsche stared at it for a long moment. Her hand reached out slowly, almost reluctantly, and touched the edge. The wood was smooth where he had sanded it. The wheels turned freely. The padding was clean cloth that looked like it had been cut from a shirt. "You made this," she said, and it was not a question. Elijah shrugged a minimal gesture that could have meant anything or nothing. "For me?" Nietzsche continued, her voice softer now, almost wondering. He nodded once. She looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing past the silent exterior to something underneath. This man had spent the night building her a way to move, not because she asked, not because he expected gratitude, simply because he had seen her struggle and decided to do something about it. "I do not beg," she said quietly, and there was warning in those words, a line drawn in the sand. She would accept help, but she would not be pitied. She would use what he offered, but she would not be diminished by the offering. "You did not," Elijah replied, and in those 2 words he acknowledged everything she had not said. In that moment, in the dusty cabin with morning light streaming through the single window, 2 broken souls found a common language. Not English, not Apache, but the language of shared pain, of fierce unbending, will of survival purchased at terrible cost. It was the beginning of understanding, fragile as new ice, but no less real for its fragility. Over the following days they found a rhythm. Each morning Elijah would lift Nietzsche from the cot to the rolling seat, his hands steady on her waist, careful of her ribs. She would pull herself forward, using her arms, building strength with each pass across the cabin floor. At first she could barely make it from the bed to the table, but she did not give up. She cursed under her breath in Apache words Elijah did not understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. Frustration, pain, determination. Her pride warred with her body's limitations every single day. But slowly, incrementally, her arms grew stronger. The blisters on her palms healed into calluses. She learned to pivot near the table, to brace herself against the doorframe, to navigate the small, cluttered space with grim grace. Elijah watched without interfering. He understood what she needed. Not help, not pity. just space to reclaim herself, to become something more than a victim, to transform from the broken thing he had found in the desert into whatever she would choose to be next. One evening, as he lit the lamp that hung from a hook in the ceiling, she asked the question that had been hanging in the air between them since that first day. "You have a name, Silent Man." Elijah paused his hand on the door. For a moment he did not respond, and Nietzsche thought perhaps he would not answer. Then, without turning around, he said simply, "Elijah." She repeated it once, testing the shape of it on her tongue. Elijah, not Eli, not Mr. Stone, just the name, plain and unadorned. He glanced back at her, then just for a moment their eyes meeting in the lamplight. Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him, leaving her alone in the golden glow, with his name still lingering in the air like smoke. That night Nietzsche sat in the chair he had made her shoulders, catching the soft light from the lamp. She was alive. She was in a stranger's house, with no legs, no family, no clear future, but for the first time since the cavalry blast had torn her body apart, she did not feel like dying. The man who had saved her, the man named Elijah, had not asked for thanks or stories or explanations. He had not demanded anything at all. And in the quiet, empty space of his not asking, something new and fragile had begun to take root. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of trust, the distant hope that she might survive long enough to become more than just a woman waiting to die. Days blurred together, each one slightly different from the last, but following the same basic pattern. Elijah rose before sunrise and worked outside tending horses and mending fences and doing all the endless tasks that kept a ranch alive in hostile country. Nietzsche taught herself to move, dragging the rolling platform across the floor until the wooden wheels wore grooves in the planks. On the fifth evening, after a dinner eaten in their usual silence, she asked another question. "You fought." Not a question exactly, more of a statement seeking confirmation. Elijah's hands, which had been whittling a piece of cedar near the fireplace, went still. He did not look up. Yes. For which side? A long pause. The wood crackled in the fire. Outside, an owl called to the darkness. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Confederate, Missouri Battalion." Nietzsche looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "And now you help me." Elijah set down the cedar and the knife. He looked directly at her then, and something in his eyes was old and tired and deeply sad. "War is done," he said. But it was not done. Not really. The war might have ended in 1865, but the hatred and fear and violence it had spawned lived on, mutating into new forms, finding new targets. The Apache were just the latest enemy in a long line of enemies, the newest threat to be destroyed or driven out or broken so completely they could never rise again. Nietzsche sat quiet that night, staring into the flames, wondering how a man who had once fought people like her could kneel beside her cot and clean her wounds without flinching. She thought maybe he had lost someone. Maybe that was what changed a man, turned him from killer to savior. Maybe pain was the only force strong enough to crack through hate. She did not ask. Not yet. Some questions required more than words to answer. 2 days later, the fever returned. It started with sweat, cold and clammy, despite the warmth of the cabin. Then came the shivering, violent shudders that rattled her bones. By nightfall, her skin was hot to the touch, her lips dry and cracked, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Elijah worked through the night with a desperate intensity he had not felt since the war. He boiled willow bark in a pan, making a bitter tea that was the closest thing to medicine he possessed. He forced it between her clenched teeth, holding her jaw open when she tried to turn away. He wiped her face and chest with cool cloths, changing them every few minutes as they warmed against her burning skin. When the fever peaked near midnight, Nietzsche began to thrash, clawing at the blanket, her fingers digging into Elijah's arm with surprising strength. She spoke in Apache broken feverish sounds he could not understand, names he thought. She was calling for people who were not there, people who could not answer. One name came through clearly. Coda. She said it over and over, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes just a whisper of loss. Her brother Elijah guessed. Someone who had left her, someone she was still trying to reach across the vast distance that separated the living from whatever lay beyond. Elijah held her through it all. When she tried to pull the stitches, he caught her hands. When she convulsed, he kept her from rolling off the cot. And when she finally went still, he checked her pulse with shaking fingers, terrified he would find nothing. But she was still there, still breathing, still alive. The fever broke just before dawn when the sky was turning from black to gray and the first birds were beginning to call. Naiche's eyes opened heavy and confused and found Elijah slumped in a chair beside the cot, still holding her hand, his head tilted back against the wall asleep. She looked at their joined hands, at his face, lined with exhaustion, at the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a night without rest. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice a ragged shadow of itself. Elijah's eyes opened immediately. He straightened his back, protesting the awkward position. "You are still here," he said, and relief colored every word. They looked at each other in the gray dawn light. The moment stretched full of things that had no names yet. Finally, Naiche spoke again. "Why?" Elijah stood, his knees cracking, and moved to the stove to start breakfast. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, he did not turn around. "Because you are alive, and I am tired of death." It was not much, but it was enough. It was more than most people would have given. And as morning light filled the cabin, as Elijah cooked eggs and bread, while Naiche sat propped against the wall watching him, both of them understood something fundamental had changed. They were no longer stranger and victim, rescuer and rescued. They were two people who had survived the night together, and that in this hard country was the beginning of everything. As Naiche's strength returned, the cabin transformed from a place of recovery into something more deliberate. A fortress, perhaps, or a last stand waiting to happen. Elijah worked with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that preparation was the only armor against chaos. On the morning of the 15th day, he began digging. The sound of the shovel biting into packed earth woke Naiche from restless sleep. She pulled herself to the window using the rolling seat and watched as Elijah excavated a rectangular space beneath the floorboards directly under the heavy table that dominated the center of the cabin, 6 feet by 8 feet deep, enough for a person to crouch or sit, deep enough to hide. When he came indeed for water dust covering his clothes and streaking his face with sweat, Naiche spoke. "You are building a tomb." Elijah drank deeply from the tin cup, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "A sanctuary," he corrected. "If they come, you go down here. You do not come up until I say." "I will not hide like a rabbit." His pale blue eyes met hers without compromise. "You will hide like someone who wants to live long enough to fight another day." They stared at each other, wills clashing in the dusty light. Finally, Naiche nodded once. She understood the difference between cowardice and strategy. Her people had been hiding and running and surviving for generations. There was no shame in using the ground itself as a weapon. Over the next 3 days, Elijah transformed the hidden cellar into a functional refuge. He lined the earthen walls with wooden planks to prevent collapse. He stored clay jars filled with water, wrapped bundles of dried meat, and hardtack tins of matches sealed with wax. He brought down one of his rifles, a Winchester repeater, along with 2 boxes of ammunition, a small oil lamp with extra fuel, blankets against the underground chill, a knife with a blade as long as a man's forearm. "How long could someone survive down there?" Naiche asked, watching him work. Elijah climbed out of the hole, his bad leg protesting the effort. 3 days, maybe 4 if they rationed carefully, long enough for trouble to pass or for help to arrive. "And if trouble does not pass?" He looked at her for a long moment, Then we fight. That same afternoon, Elijah brought Naichi outside for the first time since she had arrived. He carried her in his arms, feeling how much weight she had gained back, how the sharp edges of starvation were filling out into something closer to health. He set her on a bench he had padded with folded blankets, positioning it where she could see the entire property. The ranch spread before them in the late afternoon light. The cabin and barn. The corral where 2 horses grazed. The well with its creaking windmill. Beyond that, desert stretching to distant mountains, vast and empty and beautiful in its harshness. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust and something indefinable that was simply the smell of the west. Naichi breathed deeply, her eyes closed, her face turned toward the sun. "I had forgotten," she said softly, "what wind feels like, what sky looks like." Elijah stood beside the bench, his hand resting on the rough wood, and said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only response that did not diminish a moment. After several minutes, Naichi opened her eyes and looked at the landscape with a different focus. She was seeing it the way a warrior sees terrain, sight lines, cover, approaches, weaknesses. "You have cleared the brush around the buildings," she observed, "so nothing can get close without being seen. The barn loft would make a good position. High ground, clear view in all directions." Elijah glanced at her with new respect. "I was thinking the same thing. You will need someone up there, someone who can shoot." "I was thinking that too." Naichi turned her head to look at him directly. "I can still shoot. Bow, rifle, pistol. My arms work fine. My eyes work fine. Put me up there, give me weapons, and I will kill anyone who comes for us." Elijah studied her face, seeing the absolute conviction in her eyes. She was not boasting. She was stating facts. "You were a warrior," he said. "Before. I am still a warrior, just different now." That evening, after the sun had set and the desert began its nightly performance of impossible stars, Elijah set up targets in the yard, fence posts with tin cans balanced on top. He brought Naichi out again this time with his Winchester and positioned her rolling seat to give her a stable platform. She took the rifle, feeling its weight, its balance. Her hands moved over it with practiced familiarity, checking the action, the sights, the ammunition. Then she lifted it to her shoulder in one smooth motion and fired. The sound cracked across the desert like thunder. The first can exploded off its post. Elijah whistled low. Again. She fired 4 more times in rapid succession. 4 more cans disappeared. When she lowered the rifle, there was something like satisfaction on her face. Not quite a smile, but close. "You were not exaggerating," Elijah said. "I do not exaggerate about killing." She paused, then added, "I taught warriors how to shoot. Men twice my size came to me to learn. The rifle is just another tool. Like knife, like bow. You point it at what you want to destroy, and you make sure your hand does not shake." Over the following days, they trained together. Elijah showed her the sight lines he had cleared, the mirror system he had rigged to watch behind the barn, the rope he had strung from the gate to the porch with small bells attached. An early warning system, crude but effective. Naichi contributed her own knowledge, suggesting where to dig shallow pits near the barn and cover them with brush. Simple traps that would not kill, but would slow an attacker, make them stumble, give defenders precious seconds. They worked in a kind of partnership that required few words. Elijah would demonstrate what he had in mind, and Naichi would refine it, add to it, improve it. They were not friends, not yet. But they were allies in the truest sense, 2 people whose survival depended on understanding each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. On the 20th day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity, Naichi asked about his past. Not directly. She had learned that direct questions made him retreat into silence. Instead, she approached it sideways. "You are good at planning for fights," she observed. "Most men who build houses, who raise cattle, they do not think like soldiers." Elijah sat with his back against the cabin wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "I was a soldier once, long enough to learn that most fighting is about preparation. The shooting, the killing, that is just the end of a long process." "What was your war like?" A long silence. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the sky. When Elijah spoke, his voice was flat, drained of emotion, pointless, bloody, full of boys killing boys because old men told them to. "You fought for the South. I fought for Missouri. I fought because my father fought, because my brothers fought, because that was what men in my family did. I was 19. I did not know anything except what my father taught me." He paused, and something in his posture shifted, became more rigid. "I killed a Union soldier at Wilson's Creek, August 1861. He was maybe 20 years old. After the battle, I went through his pockets looking for ammunition, found a letter instead." Nietzsche waited, sensing there was more. The letter was from his wife. They had a baby girl named Mary. The wife wrote about how Mary had learned to say "Papa," how she waited by the window every evening, hoping to see him come home. Elijah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I put that letter back in his pocket. I carried him to where his people could find him. And after that, I stopped believing in the cause. I fought for 6 more months because desertion meant hanging. Then the war ended, and I came west to forget." "Did you forget?" "No. You do not forget killing someone's father. You just learn to live with remembering." Nietzsche reached over and touched his arm, a brief contact that conveyed understanding without words. She knew about killing. She knew about guilt. And she knew about the weight of memories that could not be set down no matter how far you ran. On the 22nd day, Rosa Mendoza rode into the yard just after noon. Elijah saw her coming from half a mile away and had time to help Nietzsche down into the hidden cellar. The trapdoor closed. The table slid back into place. The rug settled over the seams. By the time Rosa's horse reached the porch, there was no sign anyone but Elijah occupied the cabin. Rosa was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with gray threading through her black hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of hard years and harder losses. She ran the general store in Copper Creek and knew everyone's business because everyone had to buy supplies from her eventually. She had sold Elijah flour and coffee and ammunition for 3 years without ever asking why he lived alone or what demons haunted him. He respected her for that silence. But today, she had not come to sell. She had come to warn. "Elijah," she said without dismounting, "we need to talk." He stepped down from the porch, his hand resting casually on his belt near his revolver, not threatening, just aware. "About what?" "About the supplies you have been buying. Bandages, women's clothing, extra food." She paused, her dark eyes searching his face. "About the Apache woman everyone in town is talking about." Elijah's expression did not change. "I do not know what you mean." Rosa swung down from her horse with practiced ease. She walked closer, lowering her voice, even though there was no one for miles to hear. "Elijah, I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to help. But you need to know what is happening in town." She told him about Silas Harlow, about how Silas had lost his wife and young son 2 years ago when Apache raiders burned their homestead outside of Tucson, about how Silas had spent those 2 years drinking and hunting and nursing his hatred until it consumed everything human inside him, about how he had assembled a group of men who called themselves the Copper Creek Defenders Vigilantes, who had appointed themselves judge and executioner for any Apache they could find. "Silas is offering $200, Rosa said, "for proof of death of an Apache woman. He knows the cavalry lost someone in a skirmish north of here. He knows someone bought supplies that suggest they are caring for an injured person, and he knows you are the only one living out this direction who would have reason to buy women's things." Elijah felt ice forming in his chest. How long before he comes looking? Maybe a week, maybe less. He is gathering his men, making sure they have enough people to search every ranch within 20 miles. Rosa stepped closer, her voice urgent. "Elijah, if you are hiding someone, if you are helping someone, you need to know that Silas will not just want her. he will want you too. Anyone who helps an Apache is as guilty as the Apache themselves in his eyes." "Why are you telling me this?" Rosa's face softened, and for a moment the hard, capable merchant disappeared, replaced by someone who had known grief and loss and the bitter taste of injustice. "Because my husband was Apache, Bidonkohe band. We married when I was 18 against my family's wishes, against everyone's advice. We had 10 good years together. Then one night men from town came. They said he had stolen a horse. It was a lie, but that did not matter. They hanged him in the town square and made me watch." She pulled a small leather pouch from inside her coat and held it out to Elijah. This was his medicine bag. He wore it every day of his life. "If you are hiding an Apache woman, if you are trying to save someone the way I could not save him, then give her this. Tell her Rosa Mendoza says she is not alone." Elijah took the pouch slowly. It was old, the leather worn soft, decorated with beadwork that must have taken months to complete. "Thank you," he said, and meant it with everything he had. Rosa mounted her horse. Before she rode away, she looked down at him one more time. "Be careful, Elijah. Silas Harlow is not just cruel, he is smart, and he has the law on his side." After she left, Elijah stood in the yard for a long time holding the medicine pouch, feeling the weight of what was coming settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Finally he went inside, moved the table, and opened the trap door. Nietzsche looked up at him from the darkness below her eyes, adjusting to the sudden light. "Trouble?" "Yes." He reached down to help her climb out. When she was settled in her rolling seat, he gave her the pouch and told her everything Rosa had said. Nietzsche held the medicine bag in both hands, turning it over, studying the beadwork with an expression that was part recognition and part sorrow. "She lost someone," Nietzsche said. "It was not a question. Her husband, Apache, lynched by men from town." Nietzsche closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language, a prayer perhaps, or a blessing for the dead. When she opened her eyes again, they were harder than Elijah had ever seen them. "This Silas, he will come for me." "We do not know that." "Yes, we do. You know it. I know it. The only question is when." She tied the medicine pouch to her belt, then looked up at him with absolute certainty. "We prepare. We make this place into a fortress, and when they come, we show them what it costs to hunt Apache." That night they made plans. Elijah sketched the property in charcoal on a flat piece of wood, showing the cabin, the barn, the approaches from each direction. Nietzsche studied it with the eye of someone who had defended positions before, who understood how to turn disadvantage into strength. "The barn loft," she said, pointing. "That is where I will be. Give me the Winchester and enough ammunition to hold off an army. You will be exposed up there. I will have high ground and clear sight. Anyone who comes close, I will see them before they see me." She traced a line from the barn to the cabin. "You stay here by the door. Cover the main approach. If they split up, I take the ones who try to flank. What if they burn us out? Then we use the cellar. Wait until they think we are gone, then come up behind them." Her finger moved across the sketch, marking positions, calculating angles. "We will need water up in the loft. Food, too. If they lay siege, we must be able to stay up there for days." Elijah looked at her with something approaching awe. "You have done this before." "Many times. My people have been hunted for generations. We learned to make every rock, every tree, every shadow into a weapon. Your house is better than most places we defended. If we prepare correctly, 5 men cannot take it. Maybe not even 10. They worked through the night and into the next day. Elijah hauled water barrels up to the barn loft and stocked them with dried food and ammunition. He reinforced the ladder with new rungs and created a second escape route through a hole in the back wall that dropped down into an old irrigation ditch. Nietzsche contributed ideas constantly, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of warriors who had survived by being smarter than their enemies. On the morning of the 25th day, they were as ready as they could be. The cabin and barn were fortified. Weapons were loaded and positioned. Escape routes were clear. Warning systems were in place. They had done everything possible to prepare for the storm they both knew was coming. And then just before noon the storm arrived in a different form than either of them expected. The arrow came in the night, silent as prayer. Elijah heard it before he saw it, the soft thunk of impact against wood. He was up immediately, revolver in hand, moving to the door with the practiced silence of a man who had done sentry duty in a war. Behind him, Nietzsche was already pulling herself into the hidden cellar without needing to be told. Elijah eased the door open and saw the arrow embedded in the frame, fletched with hawk feathers and bound with a strip of cloth. The cloth was not random decoration. It was a message carrier. He pulled the arrow free, brought it inside, and relit the lamp. The cloth, when unwrapped, bore symbols he did not recognize. Apache writing or something close to it. "Nietzsche," he called softly down into the cellar, "you need to see this." She emerged from the trapdoor, using just her arms muscles, bunching with the effort. When she saw the cloth, her face went through a series of expressions too quick to follow. Surprise, anger, fear, recognition. She took it from his hands and studied it in the lamplight, her lips moving silently as she read. "It is from my brother," she said finally. "Coda." Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What does it say?" "That he wants to meet, tomorrow at dawn, the old mission ruins 3 miles north." She looked up at him, and her eyes held a warning. "This could be a trap. Then we do not go. Or it could be the truth. He could be trying to warn me about something, to help." Her hands tightened on the cloth. "Or to ease his guilt before he betrays me again." They debated through the remainder of the night. Nietzsche wanted to go, needed to know what her brother wanted, needed to face the man who had abandoned her to death. Elijah argued against it, pointing out the 1,000 ways it could be an ambush. But in the end, they both knew she would go. Some questions could only be answered face to face. As the sky began to pale with approaching dawn, Elijah brought out the special saddle he had been working on in secret. It was rigged with extra straps and a padded seat that would allow Nietzsche to ride securely despite her missing legs. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You made this for me. I made it in case we need to run. You made it so I could ride like a person, not cargo, not a burden." Elijah met her eyes. "You are not a burden." They rode north as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. The old mission ruins stood on a low-rise adobe walls, crumbling back into the earth that had birthed them, wooden beams jutting like broken ribs against the sky. It had been abandoned for decades, one more casualty of the endless violence that defined this land. Elijah dismounted, first rifle ready, scanning the ruins for movement. Nothing, just wind and shadows and the call of a distant hawk. He helped Nietzsche down from the horse and watched as she settled into her rolling seat, her own rifle across her lap, her dark eyes missing nothing. They waited. The sun climbed higher. Heat began to build. Elijah was about to suggest they leave when a figure appeared at the edge of the ruins, Apache male, perhaps 30 years old. He moved with the cautious grace of someone who expected violence but hoped to avoid it. His hands were empty, held away from his body to show he carried no weapons. But Elijah noticed the knife on his belt, the way his eyes constantly swept the terrain, the coiled readiness in his stance. Coda stopped 20 feet away and looked at his sister. His face was harder than Nietzsche remembered, carved by 2 years of war and loss into something almost unrecognizable. But his eyes were the same, dark and deep and full of things he did not know how to say. "You are alive," he said in English, then repeated it in Apache. Nietzsche's response came in their native language, sharp and cold. Elijah did not understand the words, but he understood the tone, accusation, anger, hurt. Coda flinched as if struck. He replied in Apache, his voice low and urgent. They went back and forth, the conversation building in intensity, and Elijah stood to the side, feeling useless and uncertain. Finally, Nietzsche switched back to English, perhaps for his benefit. "He says he had no choice," she told Elijah, her voice tight with controlled fury. "He says the cavalry was everywhere. If he stayed with me, we both would have died." "Is that what you believe?" Elijah asked quietly. "I believe he chose his life over mine. I believe he looked at me, at what was left of me, and decided I was not worth saving." She turned her attention back to Coda, and the look she gave him could have cut stone. "I do not blame you for wanting to live, but do not come here pretending you care now. You made your choice." Coda stepped closer, hands still carefully visible. He spoke in English now, his accent thick but understandable. "I am not here to apologize. I am here to warn you. The cavalry is planning a sweep, 40 men from Fort Grant. They will search every ranch, every cabin, every cave within 30 miles of where we were attacked. They find you, they will hang both of you." Elijah's hand tightened on his rifle. "Why tell us this?" Coda looked at him directly for the first time. "Because she is my sister. I left her once. I will not let her die now." He turned back to Nietzsche. "There is a box canyon 15 miles west. Hidden, defensible. I can take you there. You can disappear. They will never find you." "And then what?" Nietzsche demanded. "Live in a cave for the rest of my life. Better than hanging." "No." The word came out flat and final. "I am done running. I am done hiding. I am done being a victim." "Then you are choosing death. I am choosing to fight." Nietzsche looked at Elijah, and something passed between them that needed no words. "We stay. We defend what is ours. And if they come, we make them pay for every inch." Coda studied them both, seeing something in their eyes that made him pause. Finally he nodded slowly. "Then I will help you. I owe you that much." "You owe me nothing," Nietzsche said. "But if you want to stand with us now, I will not turn you away. Just know that if you run again, I will put an arrow through your back myself." "I will not run." They spent the next hour at the mission ruins planning. Coda knew the land better than either of them knew where the cavalry would likely approach from, knew how many men they would bring, and what tactics they would use. He drew maps in the sand with a stick showing approach routes and weak points. Elijah and Nietzsche listened, adding their own knowledge of the ranch, discussing fields of fire and fallback positions. When they finally rode back to the ranch, Coda came with them. The three of them together, an unlikely alliance born of blood and guilt, and the shared knowledge that sometimes survival required forgiving the unforgivable. Over the next several days, they transformed the ranch into something that would make a military engineer proud. Coda helped Elijah dig additional pits and string trip wires. They built a hidden tunnel from the cellar that emerged in the dry creek bed 100 yards from the cabin, an escape route of last resort. They stockpiled ammunition and water and food in multiple locations so that if one cache was discovered or destroyed, others would remain. Nietzsche spent hours in the barn loft learning the angles, the distances, the way wind affected her shots. She practiced with the Winchester until she could load and fire without conscious thought, until the rifle became an extension of her body. Coda watched her shoot and nodded with approval. "You were always the best shot in the family," he said. "I know." On the evening of the 30th day, as they sat around a small fire outside the cabin, Coda finally spoke the words he had been holding back. "I am sorry for leaving you, for choosing myself over you, for being a coward when you needed me to be brave." Nietzsche stared into the flames for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I do not forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but you came back. That counts for something." She looked at him across the fire. "You failed me once. Do not fail me again." "I will not," Coda promised. "I swear on our mother's grave, I will not run." Elijah watched this exchange in silence, recognizing the fragile beginning of healing. Nietzsche and her brother would never be what they were before. The betrayal had cut too deep for that. But they might become something else. something forged in the fire of shared danger and tested by the willingness to stand together against the darkness. The next afternoon brought another visitor. Dr. Samuel Harrison rode up on an old mare that looked as tired as he did. The doctor was 60 years old, with a face mapped by broken veins and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He carried his medical bag and a bottle of whiskey, though Elijah suspected the whiskey was for the doctor's own use rather than for patients. Rosa had sent him. She had told him there might be someone who needed medical attention, someone who could not come to town. Doc Harrison had not asked questions. He simply packed his bag and rode out into the desert to help whoever needed helping. When he entered the cabin and saw Naiche, his expression did not change. He set down his bag, washed his hands in the basin Elijah provided, and examined her stumps with professional detachment. His fingers probed gently, checking for infection, testing the healing process, evaluating Elijah's work. "Whoever treated these knew field medicine," Doc said finally. "The wounds are clean. The stitching is good. No signs of gangrene or blood poisoning." He looked at Elijah with new respect. "Where did you learn this?" "Army medic taught me. Wilson's Creek, 1861. I paid attention because I did not want to die from a wound that could be treated." Doc nodded, then turned back to Naiche. "You are healing well, better than most would in your circumstances. You must be very strong." "I am Apache," Naiche said, as if that explained everything. "I treated Apache prisoners at Fort Bowie," Doc said quietly. "I saw how the soldiers behaved, how they spoke to prisoners, how they treated them. It was not right, not human." He reached into his bag and pulled out supplies: morphine in small brown bottles, laudanum for pain, fresh bandages, antiseptic. "If you need help, send word through Rosa. I will come." Before he left, Doc paused at the door and looked back at the three of them. Elijah, Naiche, Coda. An unlikely group. "You are making enemies," he said. "Powerful enemies. Be careful." "We will," Elijah replied. After Doc rode away, they stood together on the porch watching the sun set. For a moment the danger felt distant, almost unreal. The desert was beautiful in the evening light. The wind was cool. The horses grazed peacefully in the corral. It was easy in that moment to imagine that everything might somehow work out, but they all knew better. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, blood would water the desert sand, and only the strong would survive. On the 31st day, Lieutenant Marcus Webb rode into the yard alone. Elijah saw him from half a mile away and had time to warn Naiche and Coda. They both went into the cellar while Elijah closed the trap door and arranged everything to look normal. By the time Webb's horse reached the porch, there was no evidence that anyone but Elijah occupied the ranch. Webb dismounted slowly, his cavalry uniform dusty from the ride. He was 32 years old, with the lean build of a career soldier and eyes that had seen their share of violence. He and Elijah had history. At Wilson's Creek in 1861, Elijah had saved Webb's life when the Union soldier was shot and left behind during the Confederate retreat. Later, in 1862, after Elijah's Confederate unit was captured, they had found themselves in the same prisoner of war camp. Webb recovered from his wound, and now a lieutenant had used his influence to ensure Elijah received medical treatment. They had shared 3 months watching men die of dysentery and despair, bound by the strange brotherhood of a life debt that transcended uniforms. But that was another war, another lifetime. "Elijah Stone," Webb said, his voice neutral. "It has been a long time." "Lieutenant Webb." Elijah stood on the porch rifle, visible but not threatening. "What brings you out this way?" "Official business." Webb pulled a folded paper from his coat. "There is an Apache woman, missing after a skirmish near here. Some men in Copper Creek want her head. My colonel wants her too, for trial and execution." Elijah's face showed nothing. "I have not seen anyone." Webb studied him for a long moment. "Elijah, we both know how this works. If you are hiding someone the Army wants, I have to arrest you. But if I have no evidence, if I do not actually see anything that contradicts what you are telling me, then there is nothing I can do." He paused, letting the words settle. "I am conducting my official search now. I see one man, one cabin, no sign of anyone else. My report will say, I found nothing." "Why?" Elijah asked quietly. Webb's expression softened slightly. "Wilson's Creek, August 1861. I was shot in the leg, could not walk. You carried me 3 miles to the field hospital. Saved my life." He refolded the paper and put it back in his coat. "I owe you. Consider the debt paid." He mounted his horse, then looked down at Elijah one more time. "You have 3 days before the main sweep. 40 men under Colonel Morrison's command. They will not be as understanding as I am. Whatever you need to do, do it fast." Webb rode away, and only when the dust from his horse had settled did Elijah open the trap door. Naiche and Coda emerged both tense and ready for violence that had not come. Elijah told them what Webb had said about the 3 days, about the 40 soldiers, about the fact that official mercy had just run out. "We could use Coda's Canyon," Elijah suggested. "Disappear for a while." Naiche shook her head. "No more running. We stay. We face them here." 40 soldiers, Elijah said, "against 3 people, one of whom cannot walk." "I can shoot," Naiche countered. "I can kill. That is all that matters." They looked at each other, and Elijah saw the absolute determination in her eyes. She would not be moved. She had drawn her line in the sand, and she would hold it or die trying. And the truth was, he understood. He felt the same way. This ranch was the only thing he had left. If he abandoned it, he would have nothing. Better to fight and die here than to run and die somewhere else alone. "Then we fight," he said finally. "All of us. Together." Coda placed his hand on Naiche's shoulder. "I stand with you. Both of you." That evening, as darkness settled over the desert, they made their final preparations. Weapons were cleaned and loaded one more time. Positions were reviewed. Last words were spoken, the kind of words people say when they know tomorrow might not come. And then, just as full darkness fell, Rosa came riding hard, her horse lathered with sweat, her face pale with fear. She did not even dismount, just called out from the saddle, "They are coming tonight. Silas and his vigilantes, 5 men, maybe more. They got drunk and decided not to wait for the army. You have maybe an hour." Elijah felt ice flood his veins. "Thank you, Rosa. You need to leave now. Cannot have you caught here." Rosa nodded, tears in her eyes. "Vaya con Dios," she said the Spanish prayer for travelers. "God go with you." Then she wheeled her horse and galloped back toward town, leaving only dust and the sound of hoofbeats fading into darkness. Elijah turned to find Naiche already pulling herself toward the barn, moving faster than he had ever seen her move. Coda was checking his rifle, his face set in grim lines. The peaceful evening had shattered, replaced by the terrible clarity of approaching violence. "Positions," Elijah said. "Now." Naiche climbed the ladder to the barn loft, using only her arms muscles straining with the effort. Once up, she moved to the window that faced the main approach, the Winchester cradled in her lap. Extra ammunition stacked within easy reach. She could see the entire yard from here, could cover every approach. Coda positioned himself at the tree line, with his rifle invisible in the shadows, a ghost waiting to strike. Elijah took his place on the cabin porch shotgun, loaded with buckshot revolver on his hip, another rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach. He lit the lamp inside the cabin and left it burning, making it a target drawing attention away from the real threats waiting in the darkness. Then they waited. The night stretched out each second, an eternity. The wind carried sounds from far away. Coyote calls, the creak of the windmill, the nervous snorting of horses in the corral sensing danger on the wind. And then, cutting through the darkness, came the sound they had been dreading. Horses, multiple riders moving fast, not trying to hide their approach. Voices raised in anger and alcohol and the dangerous combination of righteousness and hate. Torches appeared in the distance, 5 or 6 points of flame bobbing in the darkness. Elijah Stone stood on his porch and watched death come riding toward him. He thought of Catherine and Lily. He thought of the 3 years he had spent as a ghost. He thought of the Apache woman in his barn, who had given him a reason to be alive again. And he thought that if this was how his story ended, at least he would end it fighting for something that mattered. The riders came closer. The torches grew brighter, and in the barn loft, Nietzsche drew back the hammer of her Winchester and smiled coldly in the darkness. They wanted war. She would give them war. The riders came to a halt at the edge of the property just beyond the gate that marked the boundary of Elijah's land. 5 men on horseback torches, held high, their faces painted orange and demonic in the flickering light. Silas Harlow sat his horse in the center, a man consumed by grief until grief had transformed into something darker and more dangerous. Elijah could see them clearly from the porch. Silas in the middle, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed, his right arm cradled against his chest from some old injury. To his left, Jed Morgan, former sheriff who had been forced out of office for drinking, but still wore his badge like it meant something. To his right, Cole Brennan, young and hot-headed, the kind of man who saw violence as proof of manhood. Behind them, Dutch Keller, a tracker who could follow a ghost across bare rock, and Reverend Isaiah Vance, a man of God who had somehow convinced himself that murder could be holy if the victims were Apache. Elijah Stone, Silas's voice cut across the darkness raw with whiskey and hatred. We know you got that Apache woman. Send her out, and we will make it quick. Elijah stood perfectly still, the shotgun held loosely at his side, his voice calm when he replied, There is no one here but me. Do not lie to us. Silas spurred his horse forward a few steps. The animal balked, sensing the tension. We got proof. We got witnesses. You've been buying bandages, women's clothes, extra food. You think we are stupid. I think you are drunk. Elijah's voice remained steady, almost conversational. I think you should go home before you do something you cannot take back. Cole Brennan, all swagger and bravado, laughed harshly. Cannot take back, old man. The only thing we cannot take back is letting you live this long. You are a traitor. You are harboring the enemy. That is a hanging offense. Elijah cocked the shotgun, a sound that carried clearly across the yard. First man who steps on my land dies. I promise you that. For a moment the tableau held. 5 men on horseback facing 1 man on a porch. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and sweat and horses. In the barn loft, Nietzsche tracked her Winchester across the group, selecting targets, calculating distances. In the tree line, Coda sighted down his rifle finger, resting lightly on the trigger. 3 against 5, not impossible odds, not if they were smart, not if they were lucky. Dutch Keller made the first move. The tracker dismounted quietly, thinking he could flank around toward the barn without being seen. He moved well, using shadows and cover approaching from an angle that should have been blind. But Elijah and Nietzsche had planned for exactly this. Dutch's boot caught the tripwire Coda had strung between 2 fence posts. The small bells tied to the wire jingled merrily in the darkness. Everything happened at once. Nietzsche's arrow whispered out of the barn loft, black fletching invisible in the darkness. It took Dutch in the right shoulder, punching through muscle and bone and dropping him to his knees with a scream that shattered the night. The other men scattered suddenly, realizing they were being hunted by an unseen enemy. Cole Brennan, young and stupid and full of rage, spurred his horse straight at the cabin porch. He had his rifle up, firing wildly, bullets smacking into the cabin wall. Elijah stood his ground, waited until Cole was close enough to see the whites of his eyes, then fired the shotgun. The buckshot caught Cole in the chest and lifted him out of the saddle. He hit the ground and did not move again. Jed Morgan and Reverend Vance dove off their horses, taking cover behind the water trough, firing at the barn where the arrow had come from. Wood splintered as bullets tore through the old planks. Nietzsche was already moving, rolling away from the window, her arms pulling her body across the loft floor with practiced speed. She reached the opposite window and brought up her Winchester. 2 shots fired so close together they almost sounded like one. Jed's rifle flew from his hands as a bullet shattered the stock. Reverend Vance screamed and clutched his left hand, blood streaming between his fingers. Coda fired from the tree line, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his position. His bullet took out Silas's horse, a cruel necessity that sent the animal crashing down with a broken leg. Silas barely managed to throw himself clear before the horse landed. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up with his revolver drawn. "Burn them out!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Burn them all!" He hurled his torch toward the cabin. It tumbled end over end through the air, trailing sparks like a comet, and landed in the dry grass near the porch. Flames caught immediately, spreading with terrifying speed. Dutch, still conscious despite the arrow in his shoulder, threw his own torch toward the barn. It hit the wall and fell into a pile of old hay that Elijah had been meaning to move for weeks. Fire bloomed in the darkness, yellow and orange and hungry. It climbed the cabin wall, licking at the dry wood, consuming everything it touched. Smoke began to pour from the barn, thick and black, and somewhere inside Nietzsche started coughing. Elijah had to choose, fight or save the cabin. He chose to fight. He dropped the shotgun and grabbed the rifle, firing at Silas, who was trying to reach cover. The bullet missed by inches, kicking up dust near Silas's boot. Silas returned fire, his aim surprisingly good for a man who had just been thrown from a horse. The bullet caught Elijah in the left shoulder, spinning him around, sending him back against the cabin wall. Pain exploded through Elijah's body, white-hot and all-consuming. He could feel blood running down his arm, soaking into his shirt. But he had been shot before. He knew the difference between a wound that would kill you and one that would just hurt like hell. This was the second kind. He could still fight. He would fight until he could not. In the barn loft, Nietzsche made a decision. The smoke was getting thicker, the fire spreading faster than she had anticipated. She could stay and die from smoke inhalation, or she could move. She chose to move. Using her arms, she pulled herself to the ladder and simply let go, dropping 10 feet to the barn floor below. The impact drove the breath from her lungs and sent agony shooting through her stumps, but she did not have time for pain. She grabbed her rifle and dragged herself toward the door. Silas saw her emerge from the burning barn, saw her pulling herself across the dirt, and something in his face changed. For just a moment the hatred faltered, replaced by shock. Here was the monster he had been hunting, the savage he had promised to destroy. But what he saw was not a monster. It was a woman dragging herself through the dirt, determination in every line of her body, refusing to die, even when death would have been easier. "There," Silas pointed, his voice hoarse. "The Apache kill her." But before anyone could fire, Nietzsche brought up her Winchester and shot from a prone position. The bullet hit Silas in the right shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He dropped his revolver and fell to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt. His face was pale with shock, his eyes wide. Reverend Vance, clutching his wounded hand, stared at Silas, bleeding in the dirt, at Cole's body sprawled near the porch, at Dutch, writhing with an arrow through his shoulder, at Jed, weaponless and terrified. The righteousness that had brought him here evaporated like morning dew. This was not a holy mission. This was slaughter. And they were losing. "We need to go," Vance said, his voice shaking. "We need to go now." Jed did not need to be told twice. He ran for the horses, his badge catching the firelight, glinting like a reminder of laws he had broken tonight. Dutch staggered after him, the arrow still jutting from his shoulder, each step sending fresh waves of agony through his body. They caught their horses, mounted clumsily, and began to retreat. Silas, bleeding and beaten, looked at Elijah standing on the porch with a rifle despite being shot. He looked at Nietzsche on the ground, still aiming at him with steady hands. He looked at Coda emerging from the tree line like a vengeful spirit. And for the first time in 2 years, Silas Harlow felt something other than hate. He felt fear. "Help me up," he said to Vance. The Reverend dismounted long enough to pull Silas to his feet and help him onto a horse. Silas swayed in the saddle, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, his face gray with pain and shock. He looked back at the burning cabin, at the 3 people who had somehow beaten 5 men, and something in his expression was almost like respect. "This is not over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elijah, leaning against the cabin wall to stay upright, blood running down his arm, looked at Silas with eyes as cold as winter. "Yes, it is. Take your men and go. If you come back, I will not miss next time." They rode away. Then a defeated army retreating into the darkness. Cole's body remained where it had fallen, a reminder of the price of hate. The fire still burned, consuming the cabin wall, threatening to spread. But they were alive. Against all odds, all three of them were alive. Coda ran to the well and began hauling up buckets of water. Elijah tried to help, but his wounded shoulder would not cooperate. Naiche pulled herself to the cabin and began beating at the flames with a wet blanket, her face streaked with soot, her arms shaking with exhaustion. Together they fought the fire with the same desperate intensity they had fought the men. It took an hour to get the flames under control. By the time they finished, one entire wall of the cabin was charred black and partially collapsed. The barn had a large hole burned through one side. The yard was churned to mud from spilled water and blood. Cole's body lay cooling in the dirt, and somewhere in the darkness, wounded men were riding toward town with a story that would change everything. Elijah sat on what remained of the porch, his back against the cabin, while Naiche used supplies from the cellar to tend his wound. The bullet had gone clean through missing bone, a lucky shot that felt unlucky at the moment. She cleaned it with whiskey that made Elijah's teeth grind together, then bandaged it with strips of clean cloth. "You could have died," she said quietly, her hands working with practiced efficiency. "So could you." Elijah looked at her, at the soot on her face, at the fierce determination in her eyes. "You should have stayed in the cellar. And let you fight alone. I am a warrior, Elijah. This is what I do." Coda approached his rifle still in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats that might return. "They will be back, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they will come again, and next time they will bring more men." "I know," Elijah said, "but we won tonight. That counts for something." They sat together in the darkness, three people who had somehow survived what should have killed them. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by exhaustion and pain, and the dawning realization of just how close they had come to death. But they were alive, and in this hard country, that was the only victory that truly mattered. Elijah sat on what remained of the porch, his wounded shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. Naiche lay against him, her head on his good shoulder, exhaustion finally claiming her. Coda stood watch rifle ready, eyes scanning the darkness for threats that might return. "We won tonight," Elijah said quietly, "but this is not over. They will come again. Maybe not Silas, maybe not these men, but someone will come." Naiche's hand found his, their fingers interlacing. "Then we face them, together, like we did tonight." "Together," Elijah agreed. As the first birds began to call and the sky shifted from black to gray, they sat in the ruins of their battle, three people who had survived what should have killed them. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. Cole's body lay cooling in the shallow grave they had dug. The cabin wall was charred black, but they were alive, and in this hard country, that was the only victory that mattered. The sound of approaching horses made them tense once more. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with pale light, they heard horses approaching again. All three tensed, weapons ready, prepared to fight another battle they were too tired to win. But the riders who emerged from the darkness wore cavalry blue. Lieutenant Marcus Webb rode at their head, 10 soldiers behind him, their faces grim in the early morning light. Webb dismounted and surveyed the scene. The burned buildings, the churned earth, the body, the blood. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened when he saw Elijah's bandaged shoulder, saw Naiche sitting in her rolling seat with a rifle across her lap, saw Coda standing guard like a silent sentinel. "What happened here, Elijah?" Webb asked. "Vigilantes attacked. I defended my home." Webb walked closer, close enough that the soldiers could not hear, His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I see a dead man. I see fire damage. I see 3 people who look like they fought a war." He paused. "I also see what I came here to find. An Apache woman, an Apache man, harbored by a white rancher. That is treason, Elijah. By military law, I should arrest all 3 of you." Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "So arrest us." Webb stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his men, his voice carrying across the yard. "Men, we arrived too late. The vigilante attack was already over. By the time we got here, there was nothing to investigate. We found one rancher defending his property, legal under territorial law. We found no evidence of harboring fugitives. Our search is complete." The soldiers looked at each other, confusion on some faces, understanding on others. One young corporal opened his mouth as if to protest, but the sergeant next to him elbowed him hard in the ribs. Messages passed without words, orders that were not orders. A conspiracy of silence born from Webb's memory of a debt paid on a battlefield years ago. Webb mounted his horse, then looked down at Elijah one last time. "You have 24 hours. Then I cannot protect you anymore. The cavalry knows where you are. The vigilantes know where you are. Everyone knows." He paused. "If I were you, I would consider making different choices." "Noted," Elijah said. Webb nodded once, then led his men away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the morning. When they were gone, Nietzsche looked at Elijah with questions in her eyes. "He knows," she said. "He saw us. He saw everything. Why did he not arrest us?" "Because I saved his life once, at Wilson's Creek. He was 19 shot in the leg, bleeding out. I carried him 3 miles to the field hospital. He never forgot." Elijah touched his wounded shoulder, wincing. "Now we are even. The next time we meet, he will do his duty." Coda spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Then we use the time he gave us. We prepare. We decide what comes next." They spent the rest of that day in a haze of exhaustion and necessary labor. They dragged Cole's body away from the cabin and buried it in a shallow grave far from the house. Not out of respect, but because leaving a corpse to rot would bring predators. They salvaged what they could from the damaged buildings. They cleaned weapons and reloaded ammunition. They ate food that tasted like ash and smoke. As the sun set on what had been the longest day of their lives, Rosa returned. She brought fresh bandages, food, and news from town. Silas Harlow and his surviving men had ridden straight to the doctor, gotten patched up, and then Silas had collapsed. The combination of blood loss, shock, and whiskey had finally broken something in him. He was alive, but barely. The doctor said he might not make it through the week. "The town is divided," Rosa told them, her face grave. "Half the people say Silas got what he deserved. The other half are calling for your heads. The territorial marshal has been summoned from Tucson. He will be here within the week." "Marshal Brennan?" Elijah asked. "John Brennan, yes. Cole's uncle." Elijah closed his eyes. Of course, the man he had killed was related to the territorial marshal. That changed everything. Marshal Brennan was known to be fair, but he was also known to be inflexible about the law, and the law was clear on what happened to people who harbored Apache fugitives. "Then we have a week to prepare," Nietzsche said, her voice calm despite everything. "A week to decide how we want this to end." The week that followed was strange and dreamlike, existing in that suspended space between crisis and resolution. They repaired what they could. The cabin wall was patched with salvaged lumber, not pretty but functional. The barn hole was covered with canvas stretched tight. They worked together, the 3 of them, building something that felt almost like normalcy, even though they all knew it was temporary. On the 3rd day, Doc Harrison returned. He brought proper medical supplies and insisted on examining Elijah's shoulder wound. The old doctor cleaned it properly, stitched what needed stitching, and wrapped it in clean bandages that smelled of carbolic acid and hope. "You are lucky," Doc said. "Bullet went straight through. No infection yet. Should heal clean if you do not do anything stupid like getting shot again." I will do my best to avoid that, Elijah replied. Doc turned his attention to Naichi next, checking her stumps, evaluating her overall health. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her with professional assessment mixed with personal admiration. You are remarkable. Most people with injuries like yours would have given up, but you are thriving, building muscle, moving with confidence. How do you do it? Naichi met his gaze steadily. Because giving up means they win. The people who did this to me, the people who left me to die, the people who think I am broken. If I give up, they win. So I do not give up. Doc nodded slowly. Wise philosophy. I think I will steal it for myself. On the fifth day, as Elijah was checking the horses in the corral, an old Apache man rode into the yard. He was perhaps 70 years old, his face a map of wrinkles, his long gray hair braided with leather and beads. He wore traditional clothing and carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned respect through a lifetime of hard choices. Coda stepped forward, surprise and reverence mixing on his face. Red Skywalker, I did not expect to see you here. The old man dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate. He looked at Naichi for a long time, his dark eyes taking in everything. The stumps, the rolling seat, the rifle that was never far from her hand, the way she held herself with pride despite everything that had been taken from her. Red Skywalker spoke in Apache, his voice deep and resonant. Naichi listened, her expression changing from surprise to something that might have been tears if she had any left to cry. The old man reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a beaded band, the kind worn by warriors who had proven themselves in battle. He placed it around Naichi's upper arm, tying it carefully, speaking all the while in Apache. When he finished, he switched to English, perhaps for Elijah's benefit, perhaps simply because some truths needed to be spoken in multiple languages. You saved one of our daughters, Red Skywalker said, looking at Elijah. You gave her honor when others would have given only pity or death. You treated her as a person when the world said she was nothing. The spirits of our ancestors bless you for this. You are not just a man who saved a life. You are a man who saved hope itself. Elijah did not know how to respond. He simply nodded, accepting the blessing with the same quiet grace with which it had been offered. Red Skywalker turned back to Naichi. Wear this band with pride. You are still a warrior of our people. You will always be a warrior. The loss of your legs does not change what you are in here. He tapped his chest over his heart. It only changes how you fight. After the old man left, riding back into the desert as silently as he had come, Naichi sat on the porch with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of recognition, of being seen and acknowledged by her own people when she had thought herself cast out forever. Elijah sat beside her, not touching, just present. What did he say before he spoke in English? He said that my people have not forgotten me, that my name is still spoken with respect around the fires, that my nephew, my brother's son, asks about me and wants to meet the aunt he has only heard about in stories. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He said, I am not alone. I was never alone. That night the three of them sat around a small fire outside the cabin. The air was cool and clear, the stars impossibly bright, the desert alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. They passed a canteen of water, ate dried meat and bread, and talked about things that had no weight. Small things, memories of better times, dreams that might never come true but were worth having anyway. It was Naichi who finally spoke the truth they had all been avoiding. The marshal will come, and when he comes, he will have the law on his side. We cannot win against that. We can run, Coda suggested. Use the canyon, disappear for a year, maybe longer. Eventually they will forget. They will not forget, Elijah said, and I will not leave. This is my home. It is all I have left. Then what do we do? Silence stretched out, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice thoughtful. We tell the truth. When the marshal comes, we tell him exactly what happened, all of it. and we let him decide what justice looks like. That is a risk, Nietzsche said. Everything is a risk. But I am tired of hiding. I am tired of living like a fugitive on my own land. We did nothing wrong. I saved a dying woman. You survived. That is not a crime. Maybe it is time someone stood up and said that out loud. On the seventh day, just after noon, Marshal John Brennan arrived. He rode at the head of a small group, 6 men wearing deputy badges, all of them armed and serious. The marshal himself was 55 years old, with iron-gray hair and a face carved from granite. He carried a warrant official in legal calling for the arrest of Elijah Stone on charges of harboring a fugitive and treason against the United States government. Elijah stood on the porch unarmed, his hands visible, waiting. Nietzsche sat in her rolling seat beside him, also unarmed. Coda stood a few paces away, his rifle leaning against the cabin wall, but not in his hands. They had made their choice. They would face this with dignity, not violence. Marshal Brennan dismounted and approached slowly. His eyes took in everything: the repaired cabin, the patched barn, the signs of recent battle, his nephew's grave which someone had marked with a crude cross. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but colored with grief and anger. Elijah Stone, I am placing you under arrest. You have the right to speak, but I warn you that anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. I understand, Marshal. This woman, Brennan gestured at Nietzsche. Is she the Apache fugitive known as Nietzsche wanted for questioning in connection with raids against settlers? Before Elijah could answer, Nietzsche spoke up, her voice clear and strong. I am Nietzsche, Chiricahua Apache. I was a warrior. I am wanted by your army, but I have committed no crimes. I have killed men in battle, yes, but I have never killed civilians. I have never attacked women or children. I fought soldiers who invaded my land. That is not murder. That is war. Marshal Brennan looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. And you, he said to Elijah, why did you harbor her? I did not harbor a fugitive. I saved a dying woman. Elijah's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. I found her bleeding in the desert, both legs gone, left to die like an animal. I am a Christian marshal. I could not walk past suffering and pretend I did not see it. So I brought her home. I tended her wounds. And when vigilantes tried to murder us both, we defended ourselves. That is what happened. That is the whole truth. My nephew is dead because of you. Your nephew is dead because he attacked my home, because he came here with fire and guns intent on murder. I am sorry for your loss, Marshal, truly, but I will not apologize for surviving. Brennan was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Nietzsche again. Where were you 2 years ago when the Harlow family was killed? Fort Bowie. I was a prisoner. Your own records will show this. I was captured in 1879. I was held at Fort Bowie until the cavalry moved us north for transfer. The blast that took my legs happened during an escape attempt. Many of my people died. I was left behind because I could not run. Can you prove this? Lieutenant Marcus Webb can confirm it. He was there. He saw me at Fort Bowie. He knows I could not have been involved in any raids. Brennan turned to one of his deputies. Ride to Fort Grant. Get confirmation from Webb. I want it in writing. The deputy nodded and rode off immediately. Then the marshal did something unexpected. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat, unfolded it, and read aloud. I have here a sworn statement from Dr. Samuel Harrison. He states that he examined the woman called Nietzsche and found evidence of long-term imprisonment, scars from shackles, malnutrition consistent with prison rations, medical records stolen from Fort Bowie that confirm her identity and incarceration dates. He pulled out another paper. I have a statement from Rosa Mendoza. She states that Elijah Stone purchased medical supplies consistent with treating severe injuries. She states that she helped him because her own husband was Apache murdered by vigilantes despite being innocent of any crime. She states that what Elijah did was an act of Christian charity, not treason. One more paper. I have a statement from Reverend Isaiah Vance. He states that he participated in the attack on this ranch. He states that Silas Harlow was consumed by grief and hatred. He states that the vigilantes acted without legal authority, that this was attempted murder, not justice. He states that he is ashamed of his actions and will testify to these facts in any court of law. Brennan refolded the papers and looked at Elijah and Nietzsche for a long time. I came here prepared to arrest you, to see you hang. But the law is not just about punishment. It is about truth, and the truth is more complicated than I thought. He walked closer to Nietzsche, studying her face. You fought against settlers. You fought against soldiers. You killed people. Yes, Nietzsche said without hesitation. I did. Because they were killing my people. Because they were taking our land. Because we had no choice but to fight or die. And you, Brennan said to Elijah, you harbored her. You hid her from the law. You killed men who came for her. Yes, Elijah replied. I did, because she is a human being. Because leaving her to die would have been murder. Because defending my home is my right under territorial law. Brennan stood there in the sun, a man caught between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. Finally he spoke, and his voice was tired. I do not see a fugitive here. I see a woman who survived impossible odds. I see a man who acted with compassion when hatred would have been easier. I see a brother who came back to protect his sister after failing her once before. He turned to his deputies. Make a note in the official record. The Apache woman known as Nietzsche has been located. She is not a fugitive. She is a survivor of military action. She has committed no crimes in this territory. As for Elijah Stone, he acted in self-defense against an illegal vigilante attack. No charges will be filed. One of the deputies looked shocked. But Marshal, the law says I have discretion in how I enforce it. I am using that discretion now. Brennan's voice hardened. Anyone who has a problem with my decision can take it up with the territorial governor. Until then, my word is law in this district. He walked back to his horse, then paused and looked back at Elijah. My nephew made bad choices. He let Silas Harlow's hatred poison him. He died because of those choices. I mourn him. But I will not compound his mistakes by punishing innocent people. You did the right thing, Stone, even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous. That takes courage. As the marshal and his men rode away, Elijah felt something release in his chest, a tension he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was there. Beside him, Nietzsche was crying again, silent tears that spoke of relief too profound for words. Coda stood with his hand on his sister's shoulder, his own eyes wet. We are free, Nietzsche whispered. We are actually free. We are, Elijah agreed. Now we just have to figure out what to do with that freedom. 6 months later, in late February of 1882, the ranch looked transformed. The cabin had been fully repaired and expanded with a new room added for privacy and a proper roof that did not leak when it rained. The barn stood straight and solid. Fences had been mended. Cattle grazed in pastures that had been cleared of brush and stones. Nietzsche sat on the porch in the afternoon sun, her belly swollen with child, her hands resting on the curve of new life. She wore the warrior band Red Skywalker had given her, and around her neck hung the medicine pouch from Rosa's husband. She was whole in ways that had nothing to do with her missing legs. Elijah worked in the garden planting vegetables for the coming season. His shoulder had healed clean, leaving only a scar to mark where the bullet had passed through. He moved with purpose now, no longer a ghost, but a man fully alive, connected to the world in ways he had thought lost forever. Coda visited twice a month, bringing news from the Apache camp in the hidden canyon. More survivors had found their way there. A community was forming, people who had been scattered by war, finding each other and building something new. The camp had a name now. They called it New Hope, and the name seemed to carry weight, as if by naming hope they could make it real. Rosa came every week without fail, bringing supplies and gossip and fierce protective friendship. Doc Harrison stopped by monthly to check on Nietzsche's pregnancy, pronouncing her healthy and strong, and likely to deliver without complications. Even Lieutenant Webb had visited once in civilian clothes to see how they were managing. He brought gifts for the baby that was coming. Small clothes sewn by his wife, a carved wooden horse made by his own hands. The town of Copper Creek was changing too. Silas Harlow had survived his wounds, but left the territory unable to face the shame of what he had done. Reverend Vance had resigned from his church, spending his days doing charity work and trying to atone for the night he let righteousness become murder. The store that Rosa ran had become an unofficial gathering place for people who believed that maybe, just maybe, White and Apache could learn to live as neighbors instead of enemies. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Elijah came to sit beside Naichi on the porch. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, letting him feel the baby moving strong and active and full of life. "What should we name her?" Naichi asked. "If it is a girl, Hope," Elijah said without hesitation. "Hope Catherine Stone. Hope for the future, Catherine for the past that brought us here. And if it is a boy, then we will name him something that means warrior, because he will need to be strong. The world will not be kind to a child who is both white and Apache, but he will have us, and we will teach him that being different is not weakness, it is strength." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the land. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called. The wind carried the scent of sage and rain. The stars began to emerge one by one, mapping the night sky with ancient light. "They said we could not survive," Naichi said softly. "They said love between us was impossible, that we were too different, too broken, too damaged by war and loss." "They were wrong," Elijah replied. "We did not just survive. We built something, a home, a family, a future. The world will not accept us easily. No, but the world does not get to decide. We decide. We choose each other every day. We choose to build instead of destroy. We choose hope instead of hate." He leaned over and kissed her forehead gently. "That is our legacy. That is what we will teach our children. That love is stronger than anything that tries to break it." 3 months later, on a cool May morning, Hope Catherine Stone was born. She came into the world screaming with outrage, her tiny fists waving, her face scrunched with determination. Doc Harrison caught her, cleared her airways, and placed her in Naichi's arms. The baby settled immediately, recognizing her mother's heartbeat, finding peace in familiar rhythms. Elijah looked at his daughter with wonder and terror in equal measure. She was so small, so fragile, so perfect. Dark hair like her mother, pale blue eyes like her father. A bridge between two worlds born from love that had refused to die even when death seemed certain. "Hello, Hope," he whispered. "Welcome to the family." Rosa was there for the birth, helping Doc fetching water and clean cloths and saying prayers in Spanish that blessed the child and the parents and the home. Coda arrived an hour later, bringing gifts from the Apache camp. A cradle board intricately carved and decorated, small moccasins made by the oldest women in the community, a blessing from Red Skywalker, who was too old to travel but sent his words through his grandson. That evening, as the sun set on Hope's first day in the world, they gathered on the porch. Elijah held his daughter with the careful terror of a new father. Naichi sat beside him, exhausted but radiant. Coda and Rosa stood nearby, honorary aunt and uncle, to this child who represented something bigger than any of them could fully understand. "Tell me a story," Hope would say years later, when she was old enough to sit on her father's knee and demand tales of how things came to be. "Tell me how you and Mama found each other." And Elijah would tell her, not a sanitized version for children, but the truth, about war and loss and hatred, about a woman left to die in the desert and a man who chose mercy over safety, about vigilantes and battles and standing together when the world said they should stand apart, about love that grew, not despite their scars, but because of them, two broken people finding wholeness in each other. "Your mother is the strongest person I ever met," Elijah would say. not because she survived losing her legs, but because she refused to let that loss define her. She chose to live. She chose to fight. She chose to love. And that courage, that fierce determination to build something beautiful from something terrible, that is what I hope you inherit. Hope Catherine Stone grew up between two worlds. She learned English from her father and Apache from her mother. She learned to shoot from both parents, becoming as deadly with a rifle as her mother had been with a bow. She learned compassion from Doc Harrison, strength from Rosa Wisdom from her uncle Coda and the elders at New Hope. She became a teacher, not the kind who worked in fancy Eastern schools, but the kind who traveled from ranch to ranch and camp to camp, teaching anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic. But more importantly, she taught that different did not mean dangerous, that the person you feared might be the person who saved your life if you gave them the chance. When Elijah Stone died in 1920 at the age of 76, he was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch he had built with his own hands. His grave marker bore simple words, "Here lies a man who chose mercy." Nietzsche lived 3 years longer, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1923. She was buried beside him, her marker reading, "Here lies a warrior who refused to surrender." Their descendants still live in Arizona today, teachers and ranchers and doctors and lawyers. Some look more white than Apache. Some look more Apache than white. But all of them carry the story of Elijah and Nietzsche, the man and woman who proved that love could survive anything, even war, even hate, even death itself. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind blows just right and the sunset paints the sky in impossible colors, people who live on that land still say they can feel something, a presence that is not quite ghost and not quite memory, the echo of two souls who loved so fiercely that they changed the world around them one act of mercy at a time. This was their story, a story of survival and courage and the unbreakable strength of two people who refused to let the world tell them who they could love or how they should live. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, and so it is told, passed down through generations, a reminder that in the darkest times, when hate seems to be winning, when violence feels inevitable, when the easiest choice is to look away from suffering, there is always another option. We can choose mercy. We can choose courage. We can choose love. And that choice made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can echo through time and change the world forever. Years later, when Hope Catherine Stone was asked what she remembered most about her parents, she would close her eyes and smile. Every evening, she would say, "My father would carry my mother out to the porch. He would set her in her chair, and he would sit beside her. They would hold hands and watch the sun go down. And my father would say the same thing every single night. 'We made it, Catherine. We made it through another day.' And my mother would say, 'Together, Elijah. We made it together.'" Hope would pause, then her own hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant with memory. That was their prayer. That was their promise. That was their legacy. Not grand words or heroic deeds, just two people choosing each other every day until the end. In the year 1881, a man who had lost everything made the one choice that could have killed him. He saved his enemy. In the end, it was the choice that saved them both.